"Daddy, if she doesn't have a family anymore, can she borrow ours?" No one expected those innocent words to silence a multi-million-dollar estate. But in that single moment, a poor carpenter's quiet life collided with the lonely world of one of America's most powerful CEOs. Ethan Brooks lowered his hammer and looked at his 8-year-old daughter with the gentle patience that had carried them through years of hardship. Lily stood beside him with sawdust on her sneakers and hope in her bright blue eyes, completely unaware that the elegant woman standing across the driveway owned one of the largest luxury home companies in the country. Victoria Hayes had spent her entire career making impossible decisions without hesitation. She negotiated billion-dollar contracts before breakfast. She commanded boardrooms filled with executives twice her age. She had everything people admired from a distance. Yet as she looked at the little girl waiting for an answer, she realized no business victory had ever prepared her for such a simple question. It had started only a few hours earlier when Ethan arrived carrying a weathered toolbox in the back of his old pickup truck. A violent storm had damaged part of Victoria's newly purchased lakeside home just outside Asheville, North Carolina. Several expensive contractors had inspected the damage, quoted outrageous prices, and promised they could return weeks later. Ethan happened to be repairing a neighbor's porch when he noticed loose cedar shingles lifting in the afternoon wind. He knew another storm could make everything worse. Without asking who owned the property, he climbed the ladder, replaced broken boards, reinforced the roof supports, and carefully repaired every damaged section as though he were protecting his own home. The scent of fresh cedar drifted through the crisp mountain air while the steady rhythm of his hammer echoed across the quiet neighborhood. When Victoria finally arrived, she expected another invoice. Instead, she found a man wiping sawdust from his hands while his daughter collected scattered nails in a small bucket. "How much do I owe you?" Victoria asked, reaching for her purse. Ethan simply smiled. "Nothing. The roof needed fixing before the next rain. That's payment enough." Victoria blinked, convinced she had misunderstood. In her world, every minute carried a price tag. Every favor came with expectations. But this stranger had spent hours protecting her home without asking for a single dollar. Before she could speak again, Lily looked up at the elegant woman whose expensive clothes somehow failed to hide the sadness in her eyes. The little girl tilted her head with complete sincerity and softly asked the question that stopped everyone where they stood. "Daddy, if she doesn't have a family anymore, can she borrow ours?" Victoria Hayes did not answer right away. For the first time in years, silence felt heavier than any board meeting she had ever led. She looked at Lily, then at Ethan, searching for the hidden expectation she had learned to find in every conversation. There was none. Ethan rested his toolbox in the back of his aging pickup truck and gave his daughter a gentle smile. "Come on, sweetheart," he said softly. "Miss Hayes probably has a busy evening ahead of her." Lily nodded, but before climbing into the truck, she waved with complete sincerity. "Bye, Miss Victoria. I hope your house feels happy now." Those simple words lingered long after the old pickup disappeared down the winding road. The late afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh cedar across the repaired roof, while golden sunlight reflected off the windows of the enormous lakeside home. Victoria remained standing in the driveway, holding the envelope of cash she had never been allowed to hand over. It felt strangely meaningless in her hands. The following morning began the way most of her mornings did. Her assistant reviewed appointments. Attorneys waited for signatures. Executives filled the conference room with polished presentations and ambitious forecasts. Numbers climbed across giant screens while everyone discussed profits, acquisitions, and expansion. Victoria listened carefully, yet her thoughts kept returning to a little girl wearing paint-speckled sneakers who had offered a lonely stranger a place in her family without asking a single question. During a short break, she quietly asked her assistant to gather information about Ethan Brooks. The report arrived within the hour. 40 years old, licensed carpenter, widower, owner of a modest woodworking shop just outside town, known throughout the county for repairing homes damaged by storms, often charging less than competitors and sometimes refusing payment from elderly homeowners or struggling families. No lawsuits, no debt collectors, no scandals, just hundreds of handwritten reviews describing him with nearly identical words. Honest, patient, dependable, kind. Victoria read every page twice. Meanwhile, Life at Brooks Woodshop continued exactly as it always had. The scent of pine and oak filled the warm workshop, while sunlight streamed through wide windows coated with years of honest labor. Ethan measured boards carefully, his pencil moving with quiet precision before every cut. Lily sat nearby at a small workbench built especially for her, carefully sanding a birdhouse with tiny hands and complete concentration. "Do you think Miss Victoria liked the roof?" she asked. Ethan smiled without looking up. "I think she appreciated it." Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. "She looked sad even after you fixed it." Ethan paused for a brief moment before placing another piece of wood into position. "Some things cannot be repaired with nails and lumber," he said gently. "Those things take patience, kindness, and sometimes people who simply stay." Lily considered his answer with the seriousness only children possess. Outside, a sleek black SUV slowed almost to a stop across the street. Behind the tinted window, Victoria watched the father and daughter laughing together over a crooked little birdhouse, and for reasons she could not explain, she found herself wishing she had not driven past it all. Victoria drove away that afternoon, but something inside her refused to leave the little woodworking shop behind. For the next several days, she found herself taking the longer route home, telling herself it was simply the fastest way to avoid downtown traffic. Yet every time her black sport utility vehicle rolled past Brooks Woodshop, she slowed almost without thinking. Through the large front windows, she would catch brief glimpses of Ethan carefully shaping oak with steady hands while Lily organized jars of screws as though they were priceless treasures. There was no rush inside that workshop, no shouting, no pressure, only the comforting rhythm of honest work and quiet conversation. One cool Saturday morning, Victoria finally stopped making excuses. She stepped out of the vehicle wearing simple jeans, a light sweater, and a baseball cap instead of the tailored suits that usually announced her arrival before she spoke. The familiar scent of freshly cut pine drifted through the open workshop door, blending with the aroma of coffee brewing somewhere in the back. Ethan looked up from his workbench and smiled with genuine surprise. "Good morning, Miss Hayes." She returned the smile, almost awkwardly. "Please, call me Victoria." Lily looked up from painting another birdhouse and immediately waved both hands. "You came back," she exclaimed. "I was hoping you would." Victoria laughed softly. "I guess I did." Ethan brushed the sawdust from his hands. "What brings you here today?" She hesitated before answering honestly. "I have a problem that money has not been able to solve." Ethan raised an eyebrow, waiting patiently. "I bought an old oak dining table at an estate auction," she explained. "Everyone tells me it cannot be restored. They say I should replace it." Ethan walked over, studying the photographs she showed on her phone. The table was scratched, faded, and scarred by decades of use, yet his eyes softened instead of narrowing. "It can be restored," he said quietly. "It just needs someone willing to see what it used to be before deciding what it is now." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. She was no longer sure whether he was talking about the table or something else entirely. Lily tugged gently on Victoria's sleeve. "Want to help me paint?" she asked. "I am making birdhouses for the park." Victoria laughed again, a little more freely this time. "I have never painted a birdhouse." Lily grinned. "That just means today is your first day." Minutes later, the billionaire chief executive officer sat on a tiny wooden stool beside an 8-year-old girl, carefully brushing pale blue paint across unfinished cedar while Ethan quietly repaired a rocking chair nearby. No one spoke for several minutes. The only sounds were the soft scrape of sandpaper, birds singing outside the windows, and Lily humming a tune she barely remembered. Victoria realized something remarkable had happened. For the first time in many years, she had stopped thinking about quarterly reports, stock prices, and tomorrow's meetings. She was simply present. Ethan glanced toward them with a quiet smile, unaware that the woman who had built an empire was slowly discovering that the richest place she had ever entered was not a mansion or a boardroom, but a humble workshop where kindness was practiced every single day. The old oak dining table arrived at Brooks Woodshop 3 days later on the back of a delivery truck. Its surface was covered with scratches, faded rings from forgotten coffee cups, and tiny cracks that spoke of decades spent around family dinners. Most people would have called it worn out. Ethan ran his fingertips across the grain with quiet respect, almost as if greeting an old friend. "It has good bones," he said with a warm smile. "Wood remembers how it was made." Sometimes it only needs someone willing to listen. Victoria watched him carefully. She had built an entire career making fast decisions, replacing what no longer performed, investing only in what promised measurable returns. Yet here was a man who believed even an old table deserved another chance. The thought lingered with her far longer than she expected. Lily hurried over carrying 2 mugs of hot apple cider almost as large as her hands. "Break time," she announced proudly. She handed 1 mug to Victoria and the other to her father before climbing onto her little stool beside the workbench. "Daddy says everything works better after a break." Ethan laughed softly. "Not everything, but people usually do." Victoria smiled into the warm cup, surprised by how natural the conversation felt. There were no assistants interrupting, no telephones ringing, no one asking her to approve another multi-million-dollar proposal. The only sounds were the gentle hum of a ceiling fan, birds singing outside, and sandpaper gliding slowly across old oak. Hours slipped by almost unnoticed. Ethan patiently explained how every board expanded and contracted with the seasons and why rushing a restoration usually caused more damage than the years themselves. Victoria listened more carefully than she had listened to any executive presentation in months. "You really believe almost anything can be restored," she said quietly. Ethan looked at the table before answering. "Not everything becomes what it once was. Sometimes it becomes something even stronger because of what it survived." Those words settled into the room with the quiet certainty of truth. Victoria lowered her eyes, realizing she had not been thinking about the table at all. Lily suddenly held up the freshly painted birdhouse from the previous weekend. "Miss Victoria, do you want to help me hang it outside?" Victoria nodded immediately. Together they carried it beneath a large maple tree behind the workshop. Ethan followed with a small ladder and carefully secured the birdhouse to a sturdy branch about 8 feet above the ground. They stepped back together just as a tiny bluebird landed on the roof for only a second before flying away again. Lily clapped her hands with delight. "See? It already knows it is welcome." Victoria felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. She had spent years designing luxurious houses for wealthy clients, yet she had almost forgotten that a home was never measured by square footage or market value. It was measured by the people who made others feel welcome. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the mountains, Victoria reluctantly prepared to leave. She thanked Ethan for his work and promised to return once the table was finished. Neither of them noticed the photographer standing across the street beside a parked car, quietly raising a camera as the 3 of them shared one final laugh beneath the maple tree. The photograph appeared online the very next morning. It was nothing dramatic, only a quiet image of Victoria Hayes laughing beside a little girl holding a blue birdhouse while a carpenter stood nearby with sawdust on his shirt. Yet within hours the picture had spread across business blogs and local news feeds. Headlines began asking questions that no one inside Brooks' woodshop even knew existed. Who was the mysterious carpenter? Why was one of the country's most influential chief executive officers spending her weekends in a small woodworking shop instead of attending investor events? Victoria stared at the articles from the corner of her office while the city skyline stretched beyond the glass walls behind her. She had weathered criticism before. She had survived difficult negotiations, public scrutiny, and impossible deadlines. But this felt different because, for the first time, the story was not only about her. It involved a father who had never asked for attention and a little girl who deserved a quiet childhood. Across town, Ethan remained completely unaware of the growing conversation. He was carefully applying the final coat of finish to the restored oak table, allowing the rich grain to glow beneath the afternoon sunlight. Lily circled around it with wide eyes. "It looks brand new," she whispered. Ethan smiled gently. "No," he replied. "It still carries every year it has lived. Now people can simply see its beauty again." Before Lily could answer, a familiar black sport utility vehicle pulled into the gravel driveway. Victoria stepped out holding a paper bag from a neighborhood bakery instead of her usual leather briefcase. "I thought restoration deserved fresh cinnamon rolls," she said with a smile that looked far more relaxed than it had only weeks earlier. Lily clapped happily and rushed to help set 3 mismatched plates on the old picnic table outside the workshop. The warm scent of cinnamon mixed with fresh pine, while a light breeze stirred the maple leaves overhead. They shared stories instead of business plans. Lily talked about school, the birdhouse that now had 2 bluebirds visiting every morning, and her dream of building an entire village for birds one day. Victoria listened with genuine delight, asking questions no reporter or executive had ever heard her ask. Ethan quietly watched the conversation unfold. He noticed how Victoria laughed without checking her phone, how her shoulders seemed lighter, and how she looked at Lily with the quiet tenderness of someone remembering a dream she had once buried. As the afternoon faded into golden evening, Ethan carried the restored table outside so Victoria could see it beneath the natural light. She slowly placed her hand across the polished surface, her eyes glistening. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. It was always beautiful. It only needed someone willing to uncover what time had hidden. Victoria looked at him in silence. Those words settled deep inside her heart because she realized he had unknowingly described her own life. Neither of them noticed another message arriving on Victoria's phone from the chairman of her board requesting an emergency meeting first thing Monday morning, a meeting that would quietly test everything she had begun to value. Monday morning arrived beneath gray skies that matched the mood inside Hayes' living headquarters. The executive boardroom, usually filled with confidence and polished optimism, carried an unusual stillness. Victoria entered with her usual calm expression, but she immediately sensed that every seat around the long walnut table had already reached a conclusion before she had spoken a single word. The chairman folded his hands. "Victoria," he began carefully, "your leadership has never been questioned. Your recent public attention, however, has become a concern." Another board member slid a tablet across the table. The screen displayed dozens of articles, photographs, and social media discussions showing her visits to Brooks' woodshop. None of the stories were dishonest, yet together they painted a narrative the board feared investors would misunderstand. "Perception affects confidence," one director explained. "Confidence affects markets." Victoria quietly listened without interrupting. Years earlier, she would have responded with charts, projections, and carefully prepared arguments. This time, she simply looked out the window at the rain beginning to fall over the city. Another executive leaned forward. "We recommend ending all unnecessary contact until public interest fades. It protects both the company and your reputation." The room fell silent. Victoria nodded politely, but something inside her resisted the simplicity of their solution. Across town, Ethan was helping Lily assemble a small bookshelf for the local elementary school library. The workshop smelled of maple wood and fresh varnish, while soft instrumental music played from an old radio near the workbench. Lily carefully counted wooden pegs before looking toward the empty driveway. "Do you think Miss Victoria will visit today?" she asked. Ethan smiled gently without looking up from his measurements. "She has a very important job. Sometimes important people become very busy." Lily frowned slightly. She still looked happier here than anywhere else. Ethan paused for only a heartbeat. Sometimes happiness and responsibility do not arrive at the same time. That afternoon, Victoria drove toward the workshop almost by instinct. Her vehicle slowed as the familiar building came into view. Through the large windows, she saw Ethan helping Lily sand the edge of the bookshelf, while both of them laughed about something she could not hear. Her hand rested on the steering wheel. She almost pulled into the gravel driveway. Instead, she remembered the boardroom, the worried faces of employees whose careers depended upon the company, and the headlines waiting to create another story. After a long moment, she quietly drove away without stopping. Ethan happened to glance toward the road just in time to recognize the black sport utility vehicle disappearing around the bend. He said nothing. He simply lowered his eyes and continued smoothing the edge of the wood with slow, careful strokes. That evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows of her empty lakeside home, Victoria placed her hand across the beautifully restored oak table. She remembered Ethan saying that some things became stronger because of what they survived. Tears gathered in her eyes as she whispered into the silence. "I finally found peace, and now I am afraid my world will not let me keep it." At that very same moment, Lily carefully folded a drawing she had finished before bedtime. On the front, she had colored 3 smiling figures standing beneath a maple tree beside a tiny bluebird house. Tomorrow, she planned to deliver it to Miss Victoria herself, unaware that the path between their two worlds had suddenly become much harder to cross. The next afternoon, Lily carried her folded drawing all the way to the passenger seat of Ethan's pickup truck, protecting it as carefully as if it were made of glass. "Can we give this to Miss Victoria today?" she asked with hopeful eyes. Ethan looked at the colorful picture before starting the engine. 3 smiling people stood beneath a maple tree beside a tiny blue birdhouse, and across the top, written in careful block letters, were the words, "You always have a place with us." His heart tightened for a moment before he smiled gently. "We can certainly try." They drove toward Hayes' living headquarters, where polished glass reflected the bright afternoon sun, and employees hurried through revolving doors carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Lily stepped out holding the drawing against her chest. She had never seen such a tall building before. "It looks like it touches the clouds," she whispered. Inside the lobby, the receptionist greeted them politely. Ethan removed his cap with quiet respect. "We are here to leave something for Miss Hayes," he said. The receptionist recognized his name immediately. For just a brief second, sympathy crossed her face before professionalism returned. "Miss Hayes is in meetings all day," she answered kindly. "I will make sure she receives it." Lily carefully handed over the folded drawing. "Please tell her the birds came back to the birdhouse," she said with a bright smile. "And tell her Daddy finished the bookshelf." The receptionist nodded warmly. "I promise." Neither Ethan nor Lily noticed several employees watching from nearby desks, whispering after recognizing the carpenter whose photograph had appeared in so many articles. Ethan thanked the receptionist and quietly walked his daughter back outside without asking for anything more. High above them, Victoria stood behind the tinted glass of her office. She had watched them arrive from the moment the old pickup entered the parking lot. Every instinct urged her to run downstairs, yet the words from the board meeting echoed louder than her own heart. Protect the company. Protect the employees. Protect the reputation. She remained motionless until the pickup slowly disappeared into afternoon traffic. Only then did she allow herself to close the office door. Minutes later, the receptionist entered, carrying Lily's drawing. Victoria unfolded it with trembling hands. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Tucked inside was a short handwritten note in uneven pencil. "Miss Victoria, the bluebirds still remember your birdhouse. I think people remember kindness the same way. Love, Lily." Victoria pressed the drawing gently against her heart. At that very moment, the chairman called again, reminding her that investors expected a public statement addressing the recent attention. She quietly looked back at the colorful picture. It weighed almost nothing in her hands, yet it suddenly felt heavier than every contract she had ever signed. Across town, Ethan stood outside the workshop watching the evening sun settle behind the mountains. Lily slipped her small hand into his. "Do you think she got my picture?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the distant horizon and answered with quiet certainty. "Yes, sweetheart. I think she needed it more than we know." Neither of them realized that before the sun rose again, Victoria would make a decision that could change all 3 of their lives forever. The following morning began with an announcement that surprised everyone inside Hayes' living. Victoria entered the executive conference room carrying no presentation, no financial projections, and no carefully rehearsed speech. She looked around the long table at the people who had trusted her leadership for years and smiled with a calm confidence they had not seen in weeks. "I have listened to every concern," she said gently. "You asked me to protect this company, and I intend to do exactly that. But I have learned something important. A company that builds homes should never ask its people to abandon the relationships that remind them what a home truly is." The room fell silent. No one interrupted. The chairman finally spoke. "Victoria, are you saying you refuse the board's recommendation?" She nodded respectfully. "I am saying that kindness is not a liability. Integrity is not a public relations problem. If spending time with honest people damages our image, then perhaps our image needs to change." Several directors exchanged uncertain glances. No one had expected such a quiet answer delivered with such unwavering conviction. Hours later, Victoria left headquarters without security, without an assistant, and without notifying anyone where she was going. She drove through the familiar mountain roads until the wooden sign reading Brooks Woodshop appeared once again. The afternoon sun filtered through the maple branches as Ethan stood outside assembling the finished bookshelf onto the bed of his pickup before delivering it to the elementary school. He looked up, surprised to see the familiar black sport utility vehicle pull into the gravel lot. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria stepped forward holding Lily's drawing, now carefully protected inside a simple wooden frame. "I wanted to return something," she said softly. Lily ran outside the workshop before Ethan could answer. "You came back," she shouted, throwing her arms into the air with pure excitement. Victoria knelt and smiled. "I could not keep your picture," she explained. "It belongs here because it reminds people what matters." Lily looked confused. "But I made it for you." Victoria's eyes filled with quiet emotion. "Then I will keep the memory instead." Ethan noticed the tiredness behind her smile. "Rough week?" he asked gently. Victoria let out a slow breath. "The hardest one I can remember." Ethan nodded toward the old wooden bench beneath the maple tree. "Sometimes talking helps." They sat together while Lily happily checked on the bluebird family nesting inside the little birdhouse. The breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh grass across the yard. Victoria looked toward the tiny birds flying back and forth with bits of straw in their beaks. "They keep coming home," she whispered. Ethan smiled. "Because they know they are welcome." She lowered her eyes before quietly admitting the truth she had hidden from everyone else. "I have spent years building houses for strangers while forgetting how to build a life for myself." Ethan remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he answered in the same calm voice that had first repaired her roof without expecting anything in return. "The good thing about building a life is that it begins the same way as every strong house. One honest piece at a time." Lily turned toward them with a bright smile, just as another bluebird landed on the roof of the little birdhouse. And in that quiet moment, Victoria realized she was no longer searching for a place to belong. She had already found it. Nearly 1 year passed with the quiet certainty of changing seasons. Spring returned to the mountains surrounding Brooks' woodshop, filling the maple trees with fresh green leaves and welcoming the familiar bluebirds back to the little house Lily had painted. The workshop itself had changed as well. New windows welcomed more sunlight. Additional workbenches lined the walls, not because Ethan had become interested in wealth, but because every Saturday morning local children gathered there to learn how to build something with their own hands. The smell of fresh cedar and oak drifted through the open doors while laughter mixed with the gentle tapping of wooden mallets. Ethan believed every child deserved to discover the confidence that came from creating something lasting. Victoria had kept her promise to both her company and herself. She remained the chief executive officer of Hayes Living, but she also launched a foundation that restored aging community centers, libraries, and schools by hiring local craftsmen from small towns across America. At every project, she reminded her employees that strong communities were built by people who cared, not simply by impressive buildings. Investors had questioned her decision at first, yet over time the company's reputation for integrity became one of its greatest strengths. Kindness, it turned out, was good for people and good for business. On one bright Saturday afternoon, Victoria arrived at the workshop carrying nothing more than a basket filled with homemade sandwiches. She no longer needed an assistant to announce her arrival. Lily spotted her first and ran across the yard with the same joyful smile she had worn on the day they first met. "You are just in time," Lily said proudly. "Daddy is hanging the new sign." Victoria looked toward the front of the workshop where Ethan stood on a ladder carefully fastening polished cedar letters above the entrance. He climbed down, stepped back, and smiled quietly. The sign read, "Brooks Family Woodshop." Beneath those words, carved into the wood with remarkable care, appeared a smaller message that made everyone standing there pause. "Everyone is welcome home." Victoria felt her eyes fill with grateful tears. Lily slipped one small hand into Ethan's and the other into Victoria's as naturally as breathing. Months earlier, she had asked whether a lonely stranger could borrow their family. No one had answered her with words. Life itself had quietly become the answer. A pair of bluebirds fluttered from the maple tree to the little birdhouse, now weathered by rain and sunshine, but still standing strong. Ethan watched them for a moment before speaking softly. "Funny how they keep coming back." Victoria smiled. "Because they know exactly where home is." The afternoon breeze carried the scent of pine across the yard as children laughed nearby and families gathered around picnic tables built by Ethan's own hands. Nothing about the place looked extraordinary to someone driving past. It was only a modest woodworking shop in a small American town. Yet for everyone who had found hope there, it had become something far greater. Sometimes the strongest homes are not built from expensive stone or towering walls. They are built from quiet dignity, patient kindness, second chances, and hearts willing to leave the door open for someone who never expected to be welcomed inside.